What's up guys, my name's Stu, and for what feels like months now, I have been wanting to put a torpedo build on the Temporal Light Cruiser. It's a temporal ship, but it's also got that Lieutenant Commander seat, so it's going to make a good torp boat, and I'm going to be able to put Recursive Steering 3 on it, which is an amazingly heavy hitter. It also has a 5-3 weapons layout, and it's surprisingly maneuverable for a cruiser. I've had no doubt this is going to be a really cool torpedo boat, and I've been pretty eager to play around with it as one. I've been debating for weeks on whether or not I want to choose this ship for my event campaign prize, and then, just days before I finish the event campaign, Augie goes ahead and does it first, which kind of annoyed me, because like I said, I've been talking about wanting to do this for a while now. But that same night, Augie also gave me a Section 31 battlecruiser, which meant I didn't need to debate on whether or not I wanted to pick this ship or not, so I guess I can't be that annoyed, right? Fortunately, my torpedo build has some changes in comparison to Augie's. The biggest being, I'm not leaning as hard into all the temporal seating as he is. That temporal seat is also the engineering seat on that ship, and I need that engineering seating to trigger onboard Dilithium Recrystallizer. Speaking of ODR, it's been suggested that I might be putting too much effort into power generation for the sake of that trait, so I've decided to back off on that a bit by removing those two liberated Borg duty officers. Anyway, enough of me yapping, let's get a look at the ship. Here she is, the Temporal Light Cruiser. It has a 5-3 weapons layout, making it vastly superior to its legendary counterpart. Seriously, they ruined that legendary county by making it a 4-4. This one's also a temporal ship, so not only do you have the molecular deconstruction beam, but you also have a choice of 3 configurations that affect your stats. For this build, I'm using the offensive configuration. Despite its name, this configuration doesn't actually buff any of your offensive skills, like, say, your weapons, but it does buff your engine power, flight speed, and turn rate, making an already nimble ship even speedier. This ship also features a unique bridge officer layout. It only has 4 seats, but none of those seats go below Lieutenant Commander, so I'm going to have a good amount of high-level bridge officer abilities. One of those seats also happens to be a command seat, which is exactly why I've been wanting to put a torpedo build on this. In the forward weapon slots are what Augie likes to call the Fatal 4. The enhanced biomolecular photon torpedo from the Undine reputation because it is one of the hardest hitting torpedoes in the game. The Delphic distortion torpedo from the Lobi store for its debuff and its unique buff under high yield. The Dark Matter torpedo from the Discovery reputation for its Dark Matter dissolution proc and for its 2-piece bonus with the console, which gives a stacking bonus to crit severity. And the Neutronic torpedo from the Delta reputation for its radiation AoE. In the last forward slot, the Delphic dual beam bank, also from the Lobi store, for its 2-piece bonus with the torpedo, which gives a buff to crit chance and severity. Down here is my usual setup for a torpedo build. A protomatter deflector from the Fleet Colony for its buff to crit chance and severity. The prevailing innervated impulse engine from the competitive reputation for the speed buffs. The Discovery reputation shield for its extra damage to enemy shields, and the Discovery reputation warp core because there aren't really any warp cores in the game that are going to help a torpedo build on their own, so you may as well have that 2-piece with the shield. In the back first is the modulating competition mine from the competitive reputation. This mine's damage scales up over time after it's been deployed, making it potentially very powerful because mines tend to do a lot of sitting around. Also a pair of Thoron-infused quantum mines from the Delta reputation's Dilithium store for their extra radiation damage. In the device slots, first we have a bunch of kinetic batteries for the bonus damage to my projectiles, deuterium surplus for the speed buff, reactive armor catalyst in case I need a heal, red matter capacitor for a little extra buff to power levels, and the Kobayashi Maru transponder for the random buffs. In the consoles, first in the universal slot is Lorca's custom fire control for its buff to crit chance, shield penetration, and its 2-piece bonus with the Dark Matter torpedo, which is a stacking buff to crit severity. Like the Dark Matter torpedo, this also comes from the Discovery reputation. Next is the famous DPRM from the Atlas prototype Dreadnought, which is here for its click ability's massive buff to bonus damage. Point Defense Bombardment Warhead from the Tier 6 NX refit, both the Lobi store and legendary versions of the ship. This buffs my projectile damage and my critical chance, both of which are very important stats on this build. Its click ability also does a decent amount of kinetic damage as well. Ferrofluidic Hydraulic Assembly from the Terran Task Force reputation because this lowers the shared cooldown of my torpedoes. And Ordnance Accelerator from the Gamma reputation because this lowers the shared cooldown of my mines. This one also gives me another buff to projectile damage as well. Next are my 2 Lobi store consoles, Bioneural Infusion Circuits because it has the highest crit severity buff of any console in the game, and Tachyokinetic Converter for its buff to crit chance and severity. Enhanced Plasma Manifold off the Tier 1 Oberth for its buffs to shields, engines, and auxiliary power, which are needed for the onboard Dilithium Recrystallizer trait. And in the tactical slots versus the Fikiri Torment engine from the episode Leap of Faith in the Klingon Civil War arc. This is here to buff my non-hazard damage over time effects, and vulnerability locators from the Fleet Spire to buff my critical chance and torpedo damage. For my specializations, I went with Intel Officer as my primary to give me access to space flanking. This gives me bonus damage and other buffs as long as I'm firing on my enemy's rear arc. This is why positioning is so important. And for my secondary, I'm using Temporal Operative to get access to Entropic Rider, which gives me some extra physical damage over time anytime I fire my weapons, which is also being buffed by the Fakiri Torment engine. In the personal space traits, first we have Adaptive Offense for its critical chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back. Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff. Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on my team size. Innocuous for the crit severity buff and the reduction to my threat generation. Inspirational Leader for the chance to buff nearly all of my starship skills. Intel Agent Attaché to reduce the cooldown to my captain's abilities. Resonating Payload modification to reduce my enemy's physical and kinetic damage resistance. Self-modulating fire for the shield penetration. Unconventional systems to shave a little bit of time off of my universal console cooldowns. And Terran targeting systems for the crit severity buff. In the starship traits, first is Ceaseless Momentum. This gives me a buff to kinetic damage and reduces the recharge time of my torpedoes. This comes from the Nokjedge Intel Battle Cruiser. Entwined Tactical Matrices, which gives me a free torpedo spread when I use Fire at Will or Scatter Volley. This comes from the Gagarin and Kuj Miracle Worker Battle Cruisers from the C-Store. Automated Aggression from the Zentar Dreadnought Carrier. Anytime I use a Tactical or Miracle Worker ability, I fire off a Protomatter Barrage, which deals kinetic and radiation damage in a 1 kilometer radius. Onboard Dilithium Recrystallizer comes from the Infinity Lockboxes and is not attached to a starship, so it's easy to get on the exchange. Every time I use an engineering ability, I get bonus damage for every non-weapons power subsystem that I have maxed out. This is the whole reason I'm using that Tier 1 Oberth console. Subspatial Warheads off the Sona Intel Battle Cruiser from the Low-Buy store. Whenever I use Torpedo High Yield, this spawns a Subspatial Tear, which will chase down enemies and deal physical damage to anything within a 1 kilometer radius. And Terran Goodbye from the Mirror Warship for its stacking crit chance buff anytime I defeat an enemy. In the Space Reputation traits, first we have Advanced Targeting Systems for its crit severity buff, Precision for its crit chance buff, Tyler's Duality for more crit chance based off of my hull capacity, Torpedo Pre-Fire Sequence for its bonus damage to torpedoes, and Omega Kinetic Shearing for the damage over time it adds to projectile weapons. In the Bridge Officer seating, first we have Chemosite Lace Weaponry 1 for the extra radiation damage it adds to my weapons, Dispersal Pattern Beta for the extra mines, Concentrate Firepower 3 for its buff to kinetic damage and the extra high yield it gives, Fire at Will and Scatter Volley 1 to trigger Entwined Tactical Matrices, High Yield 3 to buff my torpedoes, Emergency Power to Engines to buff my engine power, Aux to Bat 1 as part of my Bridge Officer cooldowns, Structural Integrity Collapse 3 for its physical and kinetic damage debuff, Recursive Shearing 3 builds up power over the course of 5 seconds as your target takes damage, and deals 30% of that total damage as physical damage to your target. This often results in some massive single hits. Over here is Tractor Beam to trigger unconventional systems, Delayed Overload Cascade for its kinetic damage, and Photonic Officer 2 for the other half of my Bridge Officer cooldowns. In the Duty Officers, I'm using 3 Projectile Officers, one of which can buff my crit severity when I fire a projectile weapon, the other 2 doing the same thing but for critical chance. And finally 3 Technicians that reduce my Bridge Officer cooldowns whenever I use Aux to Bat. Like I said earlier in the video, I've been trying to reduce the focus of the power generation because I think I've been going overboard with it. By ditching some of that stuff, I've been able to focus more on my critical chance and severity, which I am always desperate for. That's why instead of those Borg Duty Officers, I'm using these Projectile Officers, and why I ditched Phase Space Membrane to bring back the Tachyokinetic Converter. Though I'd probably take it out again if I had Immolating Phaser Lance. I'd love to be able to pair that with Universal Designs, for which I would probably trade out Automated Aggression for. Of course, I don't have either of those ships, so that's not going to happen anytime soon. Anyway, let's go watch the IC and then have a look at the Parse. 461k. Not gonna lie, I was hoping for something more in the 500 range, but with this group, that's still a really good score. I think I could have done a bit better if I wasn't so timid with delayed overload cascade. I'm always so nervous I'm going to throw the spheres in every direction and then we're going to miss one and that'll screw up the whole run. I was also a bit slow getting to the second transformer because I was having to chase down a sphere. I don't know, maybe I'll switch to Very Cold in Space for the debuff. Nah, we'll keep the one that deals damage. So yeah, that's the build. I hope this has helped you in putting together your own Temporal Light Cruiser. Another thank you to Augmented Dictator Games, this time for hosting that ISE run during his live stream here on YouTube. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications down below, you know, all that YouTube stuff. It really does help the channel. My name's Stu, and I hope you guys like this ship as much as I do because you're going to be seeing more of it. We got like 3 more builds lined up for it. I wasn't kidding when I said you can fly this thing however you want.